Okay. Fear, the universal primary. Remember primary repression, how I'm defining it, is it's a set of traits and emotions. It's not just one. And the word itself, or the words primary repression, are pointing to that. They're pointing to what you primarily avoid. And so whatever you primarily avoid in childhood is what created the false self. It can't be or can't express these things which are real for you. Deficiency story, false self becomes your identity from that. So we want to re-own those aspects of ourselves. That's what puts to sleep the ego identity, puts it to rest, I should say, is to get to the repression that creates it, trauma that creates it. So that is embodied realization. That's the whole path there in a nutshell. So where does fear fit in as in repression? For this, I want to pull the map up. I swear every time I do this, when I'm looking for something, I can't find it. But if I stop looking for it, it would be right here. Give me a second, guys. Let's see. This might be it. Yep, here it is. Here's the map. Well, right off the bat, see the red? That is fear. We sometimes refer to that as frozen fear because this is fear that's old. So it's frozen in the body. I'm going to keep the map up for a bit so we can just sit here and talk because I think this is an important part of it to understand it. This is not theory. This is how we've mapped out our practice here in KI. This is experience here. So the fear, go to the third dimension first, and I'll explain this. Let me help you with that. So here, if we focus on third dimension, and you can see the fear keeps us safe. Well, it's connected to safety, say it that way. And at this third dimension level, it's the fear of expressing our primary. So it would be the fear of expressing and showing anger. It would be the fear of expressing and showing fear even, or the fear of expressing and showing, or excuse me, feeling and expressing hurt. I meant to say that for all of them. It's the fear of feeling, expressing whatever that is. So the reason we call it frozen is because it's old. And when you encounter it in your body, it won't feel like fear. At first, just like anger that's repressed doesn't feel like anger. It feels like contraction or pain. So if you're experiencing some emotion, that's probably not repressed. But if you're experiencing contraction or pain or just tension in the body, or it's hard to explain it because it's energy, that's repression. Because remember, it's old. And so fear, I call it frozen, but it's not really frozen. It's not cold. It's just thick and it's no longer, doesn't feel like fear. So we have to transmute that fear back into presence, you could say, or back into just our life force energy. Right now, when we have trauma and repression, that fear is locked into the body. It has programming with it. And the programming is basically, again, trying to keep you safe in a number of different ways. So what it does, for example, when you get to first dimension, it's already active when you're in first dimension spiritual practice, but you can't see it. It's dark matter. How does it show up? Well, look on the left here. The left that has the list of visible conscious landing points. So for example, if you see a shadow, let's say you shadow somebody who is very talkative, but the shadow if you did third dimension, you would learn that it comes from repression. Let's say anger repression, because if you can't talk, if you're having to hold yourself back in your anger, then other people who do talk a lot could be a shadow. Well, but then where's the fear? See how it's hidden? It's the fear of expressing anger. That's layered in the body and it's frozen and old. So what you might notice are what Toshi has said are visible conscious landings. See, we're aware of the shadow. We're not aware of the repression and the frozen fear in the body when the shadow is there. In the first dimension, we're not. And that's why it could be a bypass, because we're not aware of the root suffering that creates the shadow. Let's just go down the list so we can be really clear about this. This is for the diehards who are really deep into this work, who are going to want to understand all these intricacies. For some of you will just be bored with this because you're not doing KI yet. You have to be doing KI to feel this is juicy, and it's really juicy when you're doing KI. To understand all this, triggers. For example, what does a trigger have to do with frozen fear? See, because the frozen fear is down here in the body, hidden. Well, what does that have to do? Well, see how the red lines go through everything there? That's right, because they are the fears in our experience always running through all of our experience. So with the trigger, let's say the trigger is not so much a shadow. We differentiate those things here, but a trigger would just be, I'm pissed or I'm upset at my wife. But remember, when we do a deficiency story, boomerangs, and this is what I encourage when you're triggered, is boomerang that. So my wife did or said this. What does that mean about me? What deficiency story comes up here? And then let's say I'm unheard comes up, and that's the identity. Well, again, how does that relate to fear? Can you see how unconscious this is as I explain this? No wonder we bypass this fear and repression. Here's the trigger on the surface, which is the identity of I'm unheard or whatever. But that's connected to the repression, some repression. We know that now. We know that you're holding anger back, for example, or hurt. And therefore, since childhood, you've had to identify with a deficiency story. That's not really who you are, but you can't express your authentic emotions. So you can't be yourself, see? So when the trigger happens, false self. But fear is involved because there's a fear of expressing that emotion that's under the trigger. So if you're an anger repressor, the fear, which is actually the contraction, say, that you experience in a trigger, that contraction is frozen fear and your primary in your anger repression or other repression. So on the surface, the visible conscious thing is the trigger. Down below, it's frozen fear and anger repression, or frozen fear and hurt repression. You see how you can't see that in first dimension? Well, because it's buried in the body, but you can't see it in second dimension inquiry either. I'm going to go back to first in a second, but second dimension inquiry, what defines second dimension inquiry? We finally start prompting some things up. So first dimension is just be with what is, right? We're not prompting anything up. There's no inquiry. Whatever arises, arises. Whatever doesn't, doesn't. That's first dimension. Second dimension is we started to get smarter than that. On the path, many of us started asking questions or using inquiries, and then it started to prompt things up for us. That has gone deeper somatically for many of us, but it doesn't get to the repression and frozen fear. For the same reason that I've always said, repression and frozen fear is locked into the body, unconscious and hidden. It's the contraction or the pain or something that's like dark matter. You can't see it, but it's producing all this. So it might, if you do second dimension, again, a good second dimension inquiry is mining, for example. So if you've got this sensation in your stomach and you're in second dimension, you might say, well, what does this sensation mean about me? But what doesn't usually come up is, I'm afraid to express anger or hurt. That usually doesn't come up. When you ask open-ended questions of inquiry, the repression and the frozen fear just likes to hide because it's there protecting you. It's not going to come up that easily. This is why we often miss it in second dimension. And we can miss it with almost every second dimension tool, not just mine, but even like Byron Katie's. Nothing wrong with Byron. I love Byron Katie's work. It's nothing to do with her work. It has to do with second dimension. It's nothing to do with KI. It's nothing to do with Hakomi or any great non-dual teacher. It's just really hard to reach repression and frozen fear in second dimension. because what generally comes up are safer things. See, Toshi did this map. He even wrote down right under second, you can see safer unconscious landing. So in other words, it's safer. Safer than what? Safer than this. Safer than the fear buried in the body or the hurt or anger. So generally what comes up when you do second dimension are safer programs. Safer than I'm afraid of anger. Safer than I can't show hurt. So it'd be something like a deficiency story what might come up, or certain narratives or stories that again are emotionally safer than the repression. Okay, just wanted to say that. My whole point here is that it's hard to reach frozen fear in both first and second dimension. That's why third dimension was created, to reach the trauma. Let's go back to first dimension and let's go down this list so that we're really crystal clear on how frozen fear is affecting everything. And I want you to understand this is not theory. This is like, this map came after my work. It was how I put the work into a form. It's not a theory. It's like, this is what I've recognized in my experience. If you go into inquiry, you'll recognize it too, I think. So just keep that in mind in case you're going, oh my God, all these concepts. Well, but these concepts are here to point us to an area of unconsciousness that we're missing. So sometimes it's helpful just to sit and listen and really soak this in. So for example, addictions. How many times, I don't know about you, how many studies I have read, it will boggle the mind about how addiction is driven by emotional repression. But what the hell do you do with that? Because first of all, the fear of expressing anger is hidden in the body. So if I want to drink wine, the very last thing that I'm thinking about is my anger towards dad and the fear of expressing that. What I'm thinking about is the wine. Well, but that's the bypass. That is the whole problem with first dimension, is that we can't see the root of the suffering. But let me explain the root. And then of course, KI will take you to the practice of it. That's different, right? Than just understanding it. But here, so, I think a very superficial understanding would be like the fear of not being able to drink wine. That's scary too. Like if you're drinking every day and you can't get it, that's going to bring up fear. But I'm talking about a different fear. I'm not even talking about the fear that's around shame in drinking, for example. Like you might be drinking in private and very afraid of letting people know. That could be connected to the repression, but it might not be. What I'm talking about here is just the frozen fear from childhood trauma, which isn't necessarily, when it first started, it wasn't about drinking. I know you might not be able to remember this, but some of you can. When you were in your household with your parents or your family, there were definitely certain emotions that you couldn't express. You may not have been aware of that, but along with that was the fear of expressing that. So you buried that in your body. 20 years later, 30 years later, that fear and repression is still in your body. And that's what you're medicating. You're medicating the trauma. So what we've done in KI is we've devised some inquiries that take you straight from the addiction to the repression, because that's the driver. But you can't do that in first dimension. So what I would say is if you're just now in first dimension teachings, the most that you can do is just allow your craving thoughts and feelings, but it doesn't get to the root. And I've had 15 years as a teacher in 2 treatment centers to tell you that I'm 100% sure of that you're not going to be able to actually heal trauma and truly resolve addiction in any big way if you don't get to the root of it. You don't have to believe me. I'm not here as that kind of a teacher that I want you to believe what I'm saying. I'm here to ask you to verify everything. Trust me, verify everything that I'm saying, because that's the only way it's going to sink in. Secondhand knowledge in trauma work doesn't work. It has to be firsthand direct experience. And that's how we find it with addictions. So generally, how would I access that? Let me show you. And then if you come into the members area, we'll make it more skillful for you. But basically, if I want to drink the wine, there's a lot of different inquiries that I can do around that. But I think the one that is most helpful is to go straight to the fear and emotional repression from the past. Let me show you a simple way, but this is not the most effective way. So if you want even more effective ways, come sit with me in third dimension. But for example, if you have the craving for wine, I want you to feel that energy. And as you feel that energy like you really want it, I want you to go back to your VIPs and start with like your primary. I can show anger. No, I can't. You start witnessing either thoughts of being angry or not being able to express anger. And somewhere in there, you can throw in, I'm not afraid to express anger. And that starts to bring that conditioning to the surface, the fear, the programming that's connected to the frozen fear that says, no, you cannot show hurt. And once you start making that conscious, that frozen fear, that thaws out the body even more. So that's when it becomes really skillful in third dimension. When we start thawing out frozen fear and like anger layered in the body, that has a direct effect, obviously, on the addiction because it's driving the addiction. But that's a process. And addiction is difficult to work with. So nothing that I just said is enough to work with that. I really do think it needs a higher skill level. And we're doing that in the members area if you want to join us. But I've given you a little taste right there of it. I have to say, though, if you do that inquiry, you might shut down around it for a lot of different reasons. And if you do, remember, shut down or resistance means increase your skill level. So hopefully you can come into the members area and I can show it to you why you're shutting down and how to move through that and start to really transmute that energy behind the addiction. Hey guys, I apologize for keeping the map up. That's kind of dry, but you see my face a lot. So let's look at something different. Let's just go down the list because I know that this is an area that people fog out on. This is on consciousness. So I think it's important to really understand how fear's running everything. Thought and thinking. Well, I kind of skipped over attachment and detachment, but real quick, attachment and attachment is almost always trauma. Something happened in childhood and we have a certain attachment style, and then that's trauma. And so obviously repression work is key there, trauma and repression. But thoughts and thinking, well, how is that connected to fear? Well, you guys may already have clued in on that. But what I've noticed is like if there's unprocessed fear in the body, the mind has to work like a search engine to try to overcompensate for it. That's where our story starts to dominate when we're young. It's like we're in the story trying to stay safe with a past and a future, mainly a future. Our mind is very active in the story. We're identified with it. That's because there's fear, the fear of dying and the frozen fear of trauma running that. So as you start to process the fear or any kind of processing in the body, the mind starts to get quieter. It doesn't have to work overtime anymore to overcompensate for the unprocessed fear. So basically, that's how it's connected. The thoughts are connected to the body. They're not just independent thoughts firing. They're connected to emotions. And often those emotions are not really being allowed. And that's why the thinking remains kind of consistent, like monkey mind. Okay, next topic, sensations, contractions, and pain. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think that this is exactly what I've already said. The frozen fear would actually show up as a sensation, a contraction or pain. It wouldn't show up as fear. So in first dimension, it would be that stomach tightness that you feel, but it's hard to get to like what it is, right? Because the programming within it is very hidden. The programming within it at the deepest level is I'm afraid to feel and express or to be myself. That's the frozen fear. There's other programming there, like I can't show anger or other programming, but for the most part, it's frozen fear and your repression of whatever emotions. Okay, sorry, I had a little burp there. Illness, health, hopefully at this point, it's obvious, especially if you've been reading the science, that repression is behind chronic pain and illness, a lot of times trauma. So frozen fear is connected to repression. If, for example, they already have the studies that most cancer is coming because of how we relate to anger. That's Gabor Mate. So we already know from the science that repression is behind a lot of disease and illness, chronic pain. The science isn't quite there yet on how frozen fear plays into it, but it just makes sense if you think about it. I can't express anger. I'm afraid to express anger. That fear is layered in the body with the anger repression, and therefore there's my illness, whether it's manifesting as mine was spinal stenosis, but I also had cancer. Maybe you have something and you just don't know yet that frozen fear and repression is driving it. You wouldn't know that in first dimension necessarily. Even if you learn it through the science, you don't see it directly in first dimension because it's all hidden down in the body. You wouldn't even see it in second dimension for the same reason. It doesn't come up when you prompt lightly. It seems to only come up, the fear programming, when you prompt it directly, which is what we do in third dimension. And by the way, we have a way that it feels safe to go into that. If it didn't feel safe, I never would have done it. No nervous system would ever be able to go into something that's terribly unsafe. So we've devised a way of inquiring that is going to be uncomfortable because it's old fear. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's going to be safe to move through it, especially if you become skillful. Skill here is what makes things safer. Or how do I want to say this? Skill is what allows us to move through things that don't feel safe. Say it that way. Which ends up feeling safer than just feeling overwhelmed by something, right? Or shut down by it. Okay, last thing here. This is truly for the diehards. Thank you guys. And I know there's people out here who are really enjoying it. And there are some people like, I'm not even sure I can pay attention anymore. You will thank me later. Trust me, as you get into third dimension, you're going to want to come back to this video and it'll probably make a lot more sense. Depression and mental health. I can't help but think about my own husband here. He's been really open about his issues. So he has mental health and from abandonment, extreme abandonment. His primary repression of hurt or sadness. He has anxiety. So as I've often said, with hurt or anger repression, we're afraid to feel and express that. We're afraid to be ourselves. So that can show up as anxiety, fear, or some other mental health issue. But then, of course, once you're diagnosed, it like removes you from the real issue. And that's also a problem in first dimension, because the depression or the mental health symptoms might be arising to awareness, but the root programming of frozen fear and repression are not. So in other words, you might have thoughts and feelings of like, my life is pointless. I don't have any purpose. I don't want to get out of bed. Those are the visible conscious landing. But under that would be, I'm afraid to be myself. I'm afraid to feel this, to feel that, fear and repression. Okay, so the takeaway for the first dimension talk here is that frozen fear is hidden in the body during all this. That's the bypass, because it's a source of suffering, a major source, but it's not coming into awareness, either in first dimension or second. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Second dimension, I've already talked about how deficiency stories are safer. So our system might produce an identity as safer than going to frozen fear. And so with second dimension inquiries, remember, they are not third dimension. So they tend not to get to the repression and trauma. So when you ask questions, like a lot of the inquiry questions that float around in non-duality are totally inadequate to reach the frozen fear, because it takes a very specific inquiry to conjure up the I'm afraid, the authentic I'm afraid thought and energy, and the thought and programming that says, I can't open to that. That has to be made conscious. And a lot of the inquiries, again, that teachers and certain traditions are doing are way too light. They just don't get to it. This becomes a bypass in second dimension. Again, lack of skill. So it's all relative, because you could be in second dimension sitting with teacher X and getting to some deeper stuff. And it's so much deeper than you were doing in first dimension. But relatively speaking, it's not nearly as deep as third dimension. So you could be in second dimension. The bypass in second dimension is different. There can be almost like a false confidence, which you can get in first dimension too, because you're not reaching the frozen fear and repression. And as safer things come to the surface and you allow them, it can bring about a sense of peace or balance, but that's because the repression isn't being reached. And so the repression of emotion just stays tucked into the body as contraction or whatever else. But on the surface, it might feel peaceful because you're dealing with some surface painful stuff, right? But the surface painful stuff is connected to the repression and fear. See, so there's a bypass there potentially as you're just skimming the surface constantly, not looking at identities over and over again or certain stories over and over, not seeing and not being able to access the deep frozen fear and primary repression that's producing it all. Second dimension just won't show it to you. If you find it in second dimension, it's almost like an accident. It's like some inquiry just at the right time opens something up, but then it's hard to replicate it. And so you have to be able to replicate skills to work with repression because it's a constant mechanism. If you get lucky one time, it doesn't mean that's all that it means. It's just something released, but the mechanism is still there. I'm afraid of this and I have to hold that back. So be careful because that's part of the bypass is the false confidence. And then we put it in our resume. That's the other thing I keep seeing is like, okay, so somebody taps into fear or anger repression sort of accidentally in second dimension, and there's been a big release, but because they hide the repression from themselves, they go around telling everybody, hey, I've processed my anger or my fear. False confidence, I'm done, ego. Protecting itself from the deeper emotions. To be really careful in second dimension. Spending way too much time just in deficiency stories, again, not getting to the root, the somatic root. And then here's the other thing. When we get to feel and express safer emotions in second dimension, because remember, we can't get to the repressed emotions often in second dimension. So often what you're dealing with in first and second dimension are the safer emotions. That's the bypass right there. So we have to get to the things we don't want to feel. That's third dimension, excuse me. Until then, if we just hang out in second dimension, we may only be experiencing safer emotions, but we might tell ourselves that we're going really deep because we're unaware of the repression and the frozen fear with it. Okay, now let's go to dissociation and shutdown. Again, you can experience dissociation and shutdown in any dimension, but dissociation is basically this sense of like, I'm not in my body. And shutdown is kind of like freeze, like, you know what shutdown is, like, I can't feel anything and I can't express. So you want to look for that because that's frozen fear. That's what that is. So the fear is freezing you or shutting you down, but you can't access it. And if you notice when you shut down, you don't have a lot of access to what's going on. You're shut down. So there, we've learned in third dimension to bring people out of shutdown through specific inquiries around fear. But if you don't have those inquiries, when you shut down in first or second dimension, you may just be shut down. And then you just kind of have to wait, but then it doesn't open you to the emotion that you're shut down around. When you come back out of it, you're in a safe place. It protected you from the anger or fear, the shutdown did. So in other words, you can't get to the repression and shutdown until you learn the third dimension skills. And again, don't trust me, just verify this, like come into KI, verify it all for yourself. Okay, non-dual insights. Important to talk about when it comes to fear, because that's what makes us hang on to those. We're afraid to open to something deep in the body. So we have like a half-baked realization or even 3/4 baked, whatever. This is Scott Killaby's story. So in other words, definite non-dual realization and insights that were true. However, under that was frozen fear and anger repression in my spine. So all that time that I was writing books with non-dual insights, they were very helpful, I'm sure, for people, but they were also the way that I bamboozled myself. So I wouldn't have to go into the frozen fear and anger. So I just landed on the non-dual And a lot of people are landing there, not knowing yet how to embody it or even that it isn't embodied. This is the big bypass, I think, in second dimensions when people think they're done and they start spouting a lot of non-dual stuff. And I wrote 7 books. I was spouting like crazy. And although that was authentic, like I was experiencing something, I was also self-protective by hanging on to those non-dual insights so much. So whenever you see anyone hanging on to non-dual insights, really clinging to them, you can pretty much bet that they're avoiding emotion. Because you don't have to hang on to these insights. They come and they go. You don't have to like worship them or anything like that. If you find yourself kind of devoted or fixated on something, that's probably a bypass of some sort. Okay, let's see. I just have a few percentages on my phone. Let's go to, or my iPad, third dimension. The thing to remember right off the bat about this is I have some bad news, basically. Well, when you get to third dimension, you finally start working with frozen fear. That's the good news. And wow, is it good news? It's really good news. And people are just really on fire with it because once you start thawing out frozen fear, massive changes in how you respond to life. However, it's almost impossible to get to it in first or second dimension. So like if I'm working with people who are not in third dimension, I can't even really do that much inquiry with them. And here's why. Because if I start to open up the can of worms on the frozen fear, they don't have the skill yet. And it so easily shuts them down or sends them into a bunch of fear or something. When you get skill, you don't get shut down around it. But the skill that I'm talking about is third dimension. So if you're not in third dimension, you won't hear me doing inquiries with you on frozen fear because I don't know how. And I don't know how anybody else could. If I learn how someday, I'll definitely do it. But this is why I invite people to the members area, because it takes skill and a devotion to this practice. So let me talk about this practice before I go, the inside out part of this. Every time, so when you're doing your somatic testing, I have 4% left. So when you're doing somatic testing in the beginning, you're not only going to discover that you have to hold hurt back or anger or something, you're going to discover that you're afraid to feel and express it. You're going to discover that fear and whatever emotion are there together. So when you start living your life, you're always living your life. When you live your life and you see the different forms of suffering, trigger. Once you learn third dimension, you're going to go straight back to the repression and work with the frozen fear. That's what makes it skillful. There's fear with it. It's not just buried anger. When you see shadows, it's going to lead you back inside out. Shadow, that form of suffering, points to the root of suffering, the trauma repression plus frozen fear. If you don't know how to do it, just hear it, just understand it first. There's a part that's missing here, like the how to, that's the third dimension, but the context is here. So in other words, the context is all forms of suffering point back to the primary repression, and within the primary is the frozen fear. So you're going to learn how to process that just by being in the members area in third dimension. So that's going to come alive for you. Like inside out path will be coming alive. So at some point you'll be, no matter what form of suffering comes up, you go straight into inquiry and resolve that, transmute that energy. And as you transmute that energy, you're going to start showing up differently everywhere. But it's a process. Okay. What do I want to talk about in the last few minutes? Landing. Okay, landing. Landing is the term that we use when the mind comes in and finds a practice or a platitude or a perspective, PPP, that keeps you safe. That's not really true. You're believing it because of the utility, but you don't know it, perhaps because it's coming from frozen fear in the body. So at some level, you're afraid, right? So you believe that. or you're afraid to express anger. So you start that practice because that practice keeps you safe from having to feel that. That's landing in a practice or a platitude or a position or a perspective that's keeping you safe. So how do you discover that? Because that's going to be the bypass. See, what we've seen here in KI is this. People will do some deep repression work and they hit up against some frozen fear. And because it's fear, it scares them. So they start practicing and they start doing another practice, which is close to it, but it actually keeps them safe from the fear. And they don't realize that they're bypassing. So what we say is, do this inquiry. I don't get anything out of that practice. And then listen to your body, because if you're getting safety or something else, you'll feel it because the body keeps the score. But here's the other thing. So you don't get anything out of third dimension work. You don't get love or approval or safety out of opening to anger. You don't get love, approval, or safety by opening and making conscious frozen fear. There's no utility with it because you're being your authentic self. There's only a utility when you're being your false self. You're doing it to stay safe or to get love. My husband just came. You heard that? And I said, babe, give me 10 minutes. But I only have 2% here. Okay, landing. This is how we bypass later in this path. When we don't go all the way through the repression, we land on certain practices and platitudes. It might not be a practice. It could be like a perspective that comes up and it feels very true because you're staying safe with it. But you can't see it until you do the utility to discover, oh, I believe this to stay safe. Well, every time you find that you're landing, it takes you into frozen fear inquiry. You can process the fear that makes you land. And that keeps you in the path, the authentic path, because remember, you don't get anything out of third dimension. Excuse me. You just get to be yourself. There's no utility for that. So you can trust the utility inquiry to show you where you're landing and perspectives or practices in order to not be yourself, to be the false self, to continue seeking, suffering, whatever else. I hope that helps, guys. That's all I have to say. I'm 1% out. Bye.